All right. Hey guys, how's it going? My name is Arden, and today we're talking about Dark Knight's death metal. And oh, are we? That beer is necessary. Just I think for talking about this, but look at this stack of books I got here to talk about today. I kind of let this one pile up a little bit, somewhat intentionally, in a lot of ways less about me kind of needing a break from this event because it really did drag on to a degree, and that is something we'll probably talk about a couple of times throughout this review. But also, Christmas was a particularly busy time for me for various reasons, and I really was only able to catch up on the final few books we're talking about as of like yesterday. I read the last two. I'll say that. So I have definitely been behind, and the amount of comics I got to talk about to a larger extent, it's still something I'm working on. Let's put it that way. I've been chipping away at it slowly. This is the first big step for that, but we still got the finale of X of Swords to talk about, for example. But we'll save that for later. I don't even know what to tell you about that. I haven't read those yet. um, but I have read these, and like I said, there's a lot to talk about. So this is going to be a long review because we are going to talk about Death Metal issues 5 through 6, but also a ton of related tie-ins. The Multiverse Who Laughs, Rise of the New God, Infinite Hour Exxtreme. Yeah, there's a different way, like Exxxtreme. The last stories of the DC Universe, The Secret Origin, honestly one of my favorite, but we'll talk about that in a bit. And the last 52, War of the Multiverse, which is kind of our penultimate chapter before we get into the grand finale. We'll talk a little bit about all of that beforehand later. One benefit of this stream coming out a little later, not too much later than the final issues of Death Metal, is I'm relatively comfortable with spoilers, but broadly speaking, in spite of there being legitimate criticisms of this event, in spite of it kind of going from in the early days it feeling a little underdeveloped to in the late days feeling like it was a little overblown, I loved this event. I think it's a huge step in the right direction for DC. I think it's a wonderful grand finale for the one of my favorite creative teams, I think we can safely say, in comic book history at this point, Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo. There are pros and cons to Scott Snyder in particular, but he really was on his best terms here. Tevia, thanks for joining us. Raphael, two of our best viewers right there, or just like our, I don't know, they're just reliable viewers that we can always count on to check out our content. So it's great to have you here for this particular review. Let's put it that way. I seem to be suffering from moderate connection issues, but gonna plow right through it because can't do much about that. But it looks like it's gradually recovering, so don't you worry, guys. I'm in this for the long haul anyways, and generally when that happens, yeah, it'll all wash out in the long term. Anyhow, so Raphael says overall I enjoyed the event, and that's how I would say, in spite of some problems, gosh. And I do want to spend, at the risk of derailing things too much, and I do apologize for this, but I've felt this way about other stuff before, and I want to put this to words because that's kind of what a reviewer does. And I haven't heard other people talk about this before, but I feel on some level, intentionally delay on these books. Because if you look at my stream history, like I've had time to review quite a few books over the course of like between now and the finale, and I should have, in theory, been able to fit in if I was truly prioritizing our death metal stuff here. But I just needed a break from it. I just straight up, that's how I felt about it. And that does say something about the overall nature of this event. But I think that's a little bit of self-regulation, of sort of wanting to, like, it's me pacing myself, and I think because of that I better enjoyed it. If I forced myself to read and review every single one of these books as they came out, I probably would be a lot more down on the faults of these books and a lot less willing to overlook them. But by giving myself the time that I, as a reader, needed, it definitely helped my opinion. But beyond that, I think there's something deeper about me kind of putting it off a little bit. I almost didn't want it to end on some level, and this has happened with other TV shows and stuff. The most recent example I can think of is I still haven't actually watched the final episode of Lovecraft Country. And I think part of why I put it off is because, just like with this story, I'll never be able to be in a spot where I still have more new death metal comics to read. That's a temporary thing in life, and it was hard to let go of that feeling because that's it. That's kind of it for Scott Snyder and Batman and Greg Capullo and all this stuff. Probably for a while. You never know. I have books on order from him, so obviously he's not done with DC forever. But it's pretty clear this is. And he said like he's kind of gonna maybe step back from this stuff, and I wouldn't expect him to be doing some sort of heavy lifting like this sort of thing where he's written like half of this stuff in this huge pile here, maybe more. Um, so I did like it. A lot of people kind of compare, and I just wanted to say like I did put it off though because I think in part because I didn't want to let go and I wasn't necessarily ready to let go of all this stuff just yet. Well, now. And there's a certain feeling after you finish something like this and you know it's the end of an era. It kind of reflects the nature of my thumbnail. This is the end of basically the world of DC from everything that's happened since 19 like 8 or so post crisis. Uh we have never had the kind of the end result of this story, which is the Omniverse, a fully realized multiverse on the level of the pre-crisis DC universe. And I think it was long overdue. I cannot stress that enough. If you go back and look at older videos of me criticizing the New 52, I talk about this. This is something I felt for years, and it's a wonderful little victory on my part to see some of the people out there in the world of DC, like Bob Harris and Dan Didio, who I think were holding this sort of content back when they flirted with bringing the multiverse back with stuff like Infinite Crisis. Um, they're all gone now, and Scott Snyder kind of won out with his version of the DC universe. We know there was conflict, we know there was stuff with 5G. Kind of seeing it all play out, I think the best case scenario and what options were debated has won out. Now, I guess I'm getting a little ahead of myself with saying this, but it's a big part of how I feel about death metal in general and why I will always kind of like it. Every DC story you've ever read in a comic book or seen or like in a television show or film or played in a video game or interacted with in any form now exists as part of this canon. And there's no playing around with things, no being like, oh, well, this is a side. No, it's all part of canon now, which means a writer can draw from anything they feel like, and it all works. And it's a story of continuity plus, as I like to think of it. If a writer wants to draw on some random old comic, they can, and people like me can talk about those older comics and explain the context of it, and can be relevant and pay off interesting stuff from the past, like so many things in death metal do. Or if a writer has a new vision for a character, they can go ahead and do that, and there's no real long-term damage in any direction, because we know that older versions of that character still exist somewhere out there in the world of canon, and it's all so fluid that it really doesn't matter. Like nothing's ever set in stone anymore, and it shouldn't ever be again. Now all I have to do is just not tear this all down, and we're great. But I don't think they will. I would expect most writers can recognize the value in that setting and not want to go full crisis. And in that regard, so a lot of people kind of compare this series or like this event to X of Swords because they both kind of came out at the same time, and thematically they do have similar things going on. But X of Swords is kind of doing its own thing, and it's also better than this. I will say that. But I would compare this to Secret Wars 2015 from Marvel's end. a similar kind of revamp for the universe, although I would say death metal is far more significant in its implications. But a similar kind of grand, insane reimagining of the universes, respectively, for Marvel and DC. Each kind of doing their own unique thing. Secret Wars was kind of like a super event that contained all the other Marvel events within it, which was neat. And death metal is just everyone goes full death metal. It's its own unique visual style that they established early on and paid off magnificently throughout the event. Uh, so I love that Secret Wars 2015 event. So for me to say it reminds me a lot of it, and I'd rate it very consistently towards it. Some might say it's almost a little derivative of Time Runs Out and the events leading up to and ultimately paying off of Secret War. It is kind of structured the same way. Snyder very much just kind of took over Justice League and wrote it in that direction, where there's this big long walk towards death metal that in my so I guess that's my review, and we'll kind of go through what happens a bit in these books, but maybe well, we will. We'll talk about them a little bit, but I will maybe keep the summary a little light because suddenly I'm thinking about future videos, and perhaps I have a reason not to dig into exactly what happens in all these books too much, because maybe we'll do that in the future. uh, with better preparation, narration, effects, and music, and all that stuff that y'all love. I not even say like that. I say that with no resentment. I just I'm thinking about something I wrote down recently as a future plan, and a recent like a near future plan. Let's put it that way. Tevia. So let's talk. Let's get into chat before I do anything else. With that in mind, Tevia says, "I thought this event was fun, but really all over the place." Oh, sure. We'll get into that, I think, as I go through what each of these books are about, at least. But we could talk about that even in the context of the other books I've reviewed. It really is all over the place, and part of that is the tie-ins are very optional, but also a little important here and there. Some of the tie-ins are very relevant. Some of them I just love because they're guidebooks to the Metalverse and stuff like that, which was cool to me. I love maps and details about the world and such. So yeah, I dug a lot of it, and I could even look past kind of the almost sprawling structure of this story, where it's like, oh, like we had this whole little like remember the whole side adventure with Harley Quinn and Swamp Thing and Jonah Hex was there or something. um, did that fully pay off to the later side of the event? Not really, but it nicely carried the action until Wonder Woman could start truly kicking butt. And we needed some time to really soak in this world and let the tie-ins do their thing until, this guy showed up. But I'll talk a little bit about him too, because I love I kind of really like where Batman Who Laughs kind of went in this story. He was the real star of this show, but Snyder's got a good handle on that character. Maybe let's talk about that now. Sure, let's talk about that now, because especially in the lighter half of the story where he turns into like the darkest night here. Best shown, I think, on this cover. He's got the full power of Dr. Manhattan at this point, and then some, because he's channeling all this other power. It's a whole major plot thread throughout this thing, but I don't think it's terribly important. What matters, and I think what's consistently written across this chunk of book here, where he's so transformed that he's on the power level of Perpetua, is throughout the whole thing, there's this creative thread of it's still Bruce Wayne under all these layers of power and everything. Like there's still that mind there. There's still that character there. And you needed someone like Scott Snyder to really be able to keep that thread going throughout it. And I think that makes him such a compelling villain, even right up until the end when he's duking it out across. It's really, I think it really carries the ending and kind of brings it together a bit for me. Michael Jimenez, before your comment vanishes into the void, he says, the Darkest Night is not a doubt a greater threat than the previous cosmic villains. Well, that actually gets into what I just happened to be saying. Yeah, sure. Especially because those other threats like Darkseid and the Anti-Monitor are kind of part of this story. And Though I guess people might not like that because it kind of does the J.J. Abrams thing of like, oh no, this is a super Death Star. I felt this was written a little better, where it's just sort of a natural progression. They spend a lot of time taking us through the Crisis of Infinite Earths, Infinite Crisis, and Final Crisis, such that this story kind of feels like a buildup of that rather than yet another crisis event. The biggest and most obvious example of that is when they descend back into the Metalverse and find these characters, as well as Superboy Prime, uh, just sort of flouncing around. And those three characters become a huge part of this story by not making it just lip service the way The Force Awakens kind of does with the Super Death Star, with that horrible star. I don't even remember what that thing does. It destroys a bunch of planets, and it's the worst part of that particular movie. We're not here to talk about Star Wars. It just evokes a contrast. In comparison, in death metal, those characters are very much like almost servants of Perpetua, and so like a lesser threat than the Darkest Night and Perpetua, who are the big bads of this story. But of course, it's really all about like the Darkest Night. He's the main villain. Um, but based on, and he defeats Perpetua. So basically, there's a tier list here. At the very top is the Blackest Night. Below that is Perpetua, who kind of created beings like the Anti Monitor, and then that being exists kind of on the level of Darkseid and Superboy Prime, or at least they're treated as equivalents within the story. We're not here to argue technical power levels or anything. So, my point being, that's a better way to go about it than the way J.J. Abrams would have written these comics. We can say that confidently, especially knowing that he's had his hand on writing books at this point, like comic books. So I really appreciate the little things Snyder does to really make the difference between this event and the past Crisis events, because I was talking about how it compares favorably to Secret Wars, but what it really compares favorably to is Infinite Crisis and even the Crisis of Infinite Earths. Final Crisis is kind of a different matter because we get into the whole business with, Grant Morrison. And Grant Morrison is such a different writer than Scott Snyder. It's like almost comparing apples to oranges. Those are like I don't know. I'm having trouble grappling my brain like which story's better. It's like well, it's like comparing Force Awakens to Twin Peaks or something. I don't know. Like we're going for different stuff there, and I don't know. Final Crisis is I guess more thoughtful and better structured, but death metal goes for way bigger. Like it swings higher. It has more ambition, even if it isn't necessarily as deep. Um, so I like a world where both stories exist. Let's put it that way. And I like a world where Crisis of Infinite Earths and even Infinite Crisis exists because a lot of that imagery is evoked here. But the Crisis of Infinite Earths, as much as people like it, it has a lot of these death metal style problems where it is bloated and it's all over the map in terms of continuity. Like it's not as all together as one might hope for a story that is basically set the standard for all of DC history. Even now, it's still super relevant to content in this story and other stuff going forward. So as much as I like Crisis of Infinite Earths, let's not look at it with nostalgia colored glasses. I would say death metal compares very much to it in certain ways. In other ways, it does stuff like what's on that side of the screen right now, where it's a little bit. It asks a lot of its reader, but again, just go back and look at the original Crisis. Like it's all over the place too. So that like yeah. Okay. That's just a point we had. Oh, I should say Michelle Jimenez. Sorry, your name was kind of covered when I read that last comment. He says, now we can all wait for the animated movie in DC. Can't wait for that. Oh, goodness. How. That's like three animated movies if they want to do this story right. Otherwise, it's going to feel way watered down. Let's put it that way. Tevia says, honestly, this whole Omniverse feels like the DCU era. Oh, I disagree. This feels way more like post crisis. Just a whole new direction for DC. talents kind of being shuffled around, so a lot of new writers are going to have a chance with these superheroes and really free license to redefine them a little bit. Could work. uh, there's all sorts of reasons to be at least cautiously optimistic about this stuff. And we'll kind of get our first taste of whether or not it pays off when we get into Future State. Um, this is a good question. Tevye says, any question on Bendis' exclusive contract being over at DC Comics? We kind of knew that was happening based on him already saying he was basically done with Superman. It is, I think, I'm not going to get a lot of pushback here when I say it will. I believe it'll ultimately be for the best because I read like exactly one good Bendis book, and that was Naomi. It's the only one I really liked. Everything else felt like such a dud and really sidetracked Superman series, which were awesome at the time. Adrian, thanks for joining us. And then Tevye says, can we get rid of yeah, like exactly what I just said. Adrian says, choose your own DC adventures. That's a way of putting it. Perhaps a little more derisively. I don't know if he meant it that way or not, but I'm sure people will look down on this. But I maintain my opinion. Obviously, like I'm gonna feel that way because this is what I wanted all along. But it's the best. It's for the best. Let's put it that way. It lets people do interesting things. It lets us not fret about different stuff. And they even tease a few interesting ideas in the final pages of Death Metal #7, which I quite enjoy. Tevye says, Exoswords I thought was a mess. Well, to be fair, I have missed a huge chunk of it, so I really can't speak to a lot of that yet. I will, we'll talk about that later, though, in the future. Yeah, I'm not getting good connection for this stream. Raphael says, who would you think wins from what we know so far? The Batman Who Laughs at his peak versus the current Null? Well, that's another whole event that I'm not currently up to date on, but what I know of Null, Batman Who Laughs had like cosmic powers where he just like rewrote all of reality on a whim. So perhaps that is your answer. And then Tevye says the Superboy did a great send off for Superboy Prime. Well, I think that's a good segue into let's talk about these books at least a little bit. So first up we have because basically where we last left things off, the Batman Who Laughs became the Darkest Knight and created the Dark Multiverse and just prepared to just full on assault Perpetua. And this book kind of pays everything off exactly where I thought it would, but we'll talk a little bit about it because the Multiverse Who Laughs is kind of a series of stories detailing this new world where there's all these twisted things on it. We've seen quite a few of these books before, and this one almost lost me, but it does have a few pretty fun stories, including one with Crypto and a whole bunch of other little amusing moments along the way, just enough to make me actually enjoy it, and I'm glad I read it. After that, Rise of the New God, I don't actually remember much about, but I think it kind of gets into the more cosmic things going on. And oh yeah, Metron gets revived and speaks. Oh yeah, this was a cool book because he speaks to this otherworldly, like cosmic being that sort of represents the hands. These beings that create multiverses and are supposedly coming to destroy the DC multiverse, unless the Darkest Knight destroys them and then just sort of takes over all of reality, which is his big plan. I know I'm going through these quick, but I already explained why, and based on some things in chat, you guys seem pretty on board, and you know, I've already been talking for 20 minutes, and I'll be talking for a lot more, so don't worry. This one is really fun. It talks about it's all about Lobo kind of going on his own little adventure and doing his own things. He encounters a Lobo Batman. Frank Thierry writes some of this, and that's pretty fun. The Sam Humphries does a bunch of it too, and I, for the most part, enjoyed myself. It kind of gets into him, like Lobo, getting this death metal element, which kind of plays a major role in Death Metal #5 here, where Wonder Woman, I believe, is... anyway, yeah, like they kind of go and, yeah, she gets the death metal, and it's all about her being the last hope of using it to create any sort of meaningful power against the Darkest Knight. Meanwhile, the Dark Multiverse is created specifically in this book, and all these evil versions of heroes just now created by the Darkest Night move in to attack all the other superheroes. And Perpetua uh, wages war against the Darkest Night. So that's all going on. Next up is the last story of the stories of the DC universe. Another anthology book that kind of goes over all these characters, sort of coming to terms with what could be very much their last moments on Earth. We've seen the sort of thing all over, like different. I don't need a HBO Max advertisement when I'm holding these books up here, but we've seen this kind of story before in other events where like everyone's kind of hunkered down in the trenches and doing these character driven moments, but a lot of this is built around the Titans, who are kind of the framing story where they're kind of confronting Wally West over his horrible crimes. See the disastrous reviews of Heroes in Crisis if you're interested in more about that. But this story kind of brings a lot of closure to these characters and is a bit of a send off to an era. It really feels like this is the end of a run of so many writers that started out in the New 52 era, and it kind of is closing out a lot of that content in a big way. I really appreciated a book like this, and I felt feelings when I was reading it. Like, it was emotional. It was a good story. Death Metal number 6. And by the way, we haven't been talking about art much, but can I just give a shout out to how awesome all these holographic covers were and how glad I am to have print copies every single one of these individual issues. Greg Capullo's art looks awesome. His design of so many different characters like Lex Luthor and Superman are fantastic. And then he does stuff with like cosmic battles between the Darkest Night and Perpetua waging across multiple issues that still feel wrong way. That still feel epic as hell. I really enjoyed Greg Capullo's art across all of these books, and the other artists who did a lot of the tie-ins and stuff. This was a true treat visually. It created its own unique style, partially inspired by Mad Max imagery from like that like metal music videos and album art, and kind of put it all together into this DC themed content that I just adored from start to finish. Part of why I'm an easy sell for these death metal books. Recommended every single one that we reviewed, I think, aside from maybe one or two tie-ins. Stopped reading. We didn't review every single one of the tie-ins, to be fair, because I didn't read all of them. I kind of stopped with the Justice League ones after a while because it was just too much. But to be fair, an early complaint we had of this event, like I remember saying it, and you can go back to my streams of like the first few issues, where I was saying like, this is a really cool world, but I hope we actually get to explore it. Well, we sure as hell got to explore it. So my complaint about it being like there was a lot and I kind of had to take my time with it and not read a few of those tie-ins. To be fair, I did want more at first. I certainly got more. So I definitely conditioned my criticisms a little bit with the fact that there were some cool ideas here. And then we also get tie-ins like this. This might be my favorite single book in all of death metal. It's all about Superboy Prime, and actually kind of contextualizes this character, especially across all the business around Infinite Crisis, in a way that I liked. His whole character arc is super touching. It's kind of flashing back between his origins, him bonding with Crypto before the final battle. That I got a weakness for dogs, and I got an especially weak, like a particular weakness for Crypto, who's just my favorite superhero pet of all time. And it ends up culminating with I'll just spoil this part, I guess, here, but Superboy Prime winds up wiping out the Dark Multiverse. Pretty damn cool. He ends up securing a major blow against the whole thing, and kind of goes down swinging, and then sort of wakes up in his home world after it had been destroyed and lost back in the Crisis of Infinite Earths. It's a huge payoff to his character and all the various hellish realities he had been in up until this point. This is the first time I think I ever felt a lot of sympathy for Superboy Prime, who behaved like a real sociopath way back in Infinite Crisis. And then he winds up back, like, and he was reunited with his little girlfriend character, Lori. And he ends up, and so here's his character payoff. After all he's been through, like, he's exposed to these heroes. His big argument back in Infinite Crisis was the heroes weren't doing their jobs and being all dark and broody, and he hated it to the extent he was willing to murder them all. But we're not talking about Infinite Crisis right now. But this kind of puts it in a good way, and he ends up walking down the street with Lori. Oh, and Crypto's with him, which is awesome. It's like an extra little bonus for Superboy Prime after all this crap he's been through. But this kid runs into the street in front of a car, and Superboy Prime thinks to himself, well, I don't have my powers in this universe. He never really did until the crisis. But I'm gonna just dive in and try anyways. And he ends up, turns out, he has his powers in this new reality, in the Omniverse, I guess. And he lifts the car up over his head, kind of evoking the original Superman cover, and saves the boy. And it's a brilliant ending for Superboy Prime's character, and it's a wonderful payoff to him kind of surviving, or like kind of agreeing to go with the heroes and help out after Wonder Woman kind of, yeah, it was her who reached out to him in the Dark Multiverse earlier in this story. It's a wonderful payoff to Infinite Crisis, and even some stuff that was basically brought up way back in the Crisis of Infinite Earth. So I expected nothing out of this book. I kind of just, it was part of my orders for the death metal tie-ins. I saw Superboy Prime was in the cover, but that didn't mean this whole book was going to be about him. And there's a lot of authors and writers credited for this thing, including Jeff Johns. But credit to all of them. Like, I loved this book, and that's why I did kind of want to get into these, because, you know, if you slept on this, see if you can pick it up in some form or another. I really liked it. Then then we have this pretty cool book, and it's one of the longest. Got to be 96 pages. Just like, it's funny, I can just tell by looking at it now. But it's The Last 52 War of the Multiverses. It's another anthology book, kind of framed around Wonder Woman emerging from, I think this happened actually back in issue 6, but whatever. Emerging from the Forge of the Worlds, which she delved into with the death metal, and kind of in this weird golden form where she becomes giant and just starts battling against the Darkest Night. But while they're kind of squaring off, he's like, what hope do you possibly have to defeat me? And then he says, like, look at all these other heroes battling. What hope do they have? And then the anthology book is kind of us looking at all these heroes battling in the Dark Multiverse. But to me, that's very effective. The main focus of the fight is in this book, Death Metal number 7. The rest of the heroes get their time in the sun here. And that includes Superman, Batman, the Titans, you know, all our heroes. Ryan Choi gets his moment in a fun little story. I actually liked every single one of these side stories. There's the Last Sun Superman basically going nuclear around this, and that's a whole thing that kind of leads into book number 7. Batman ends up squaring off against this sort of weird reincarnated version of the Batman Who Laughs that the Darkest Night created to just sort of mess around with Batman, because why not? And it's a fun story. Oh, Swamp Thing gets a great little run, and one of my favorites, the Penguin squares off against like 3 evil versions of the Penguin, and to battle them, he turns into a giant bird. Like, this story is where reality literally is just going off the rails. There's no more of the multiverse as we knew it. There's no more of the Dark Multiverse at this point, because Superboy Prime wiped it out. They're fighting over the scraps of what remains of reality, while 2 cosmic beings wage war above them to determine the fate of all the multiverse. That's epic. We're allowed to be excited about that sort of stuff, and I don't care what snooty critics might say about that, because some people are real down on all this. And then that all kind of comes to a head here in a book that I knew was gonna be a big one. And I like when books do this. One of our first pages, I have to turn the whole thing sideways. Oh, hey, what crazy timing. There's a lot of images it's circling through, so that's kind of funny. I don't really, I just let Windows sort of auto slideshow there. So it's always funny when it lines up like that. And this battle begins with the Darkest Knight, who Wonder Woman kind of instantly recognizes is stronger than her at the moment. Here, I'm going to move these because they're surprisingly heavy. And I'm going to be talking for a little bit here. He hits her so hard it sends her barreling through backwards in time until they end up kind of duking it out over the beginning moments of the multiverse. Meanwhile, in the present day, whatever you can call this scrap, like again, like scraps of remnants of reality, uh, things aren't going so well in the final battle. In spite of some victories in the war for the multiverses, Superman is forced to take that nuclear Superman out into space, the void, basically, because there ain't no. Well, there are stars in this shot, but there kind of shouldn't be. But I guess there is still one universe kind of around. But anyways, and like Superman's just kind of taking him down with him and deteriorating as he's doing so. But as Wonder Woman says, like, because they can both, like him and her and the Darkest Knight can both see these things in the past. Like, well, then we keep fighting, and like we'll fight it even in a hopeless situation. Even though I know you're stronger than me and I can't win, like we'll keep going no matter what kind of you know. In compare, at least it's interesting having read these books after having seen Wonder Woman 1984 because it's a much stronger take on Wonder Woman's character, and this kind of gets into where I say it's still Bruce. The way he talks to her, he's not, he's much more evil than usual, but he's still smart and he still makes points where he's like, the hands are coming, and he even shows her like they're fast approaching. If you don't if you don't let me do this, you're all going to die no matter what happens. And she ends up kind of pulling from the power of her past and her friends and stuff, knocking him back into the present where there are superheroes that banded together. She remembers everything that's ever happened to her character, and she knocks him into so far into the back into the future that they go into the end of everything where there's just one final star burning out into oblivion and starts pushing him into it. And as he dies, he's like, well, the hands are here, so you have to make a choice. And she's like looks over that, but thinks on it and just decides to push him through. There's a whole bunch of narration around it. I don't know if I can necessarily convey the actual emotional arc of it, but maybe we'll save that, like I said, for a future video. And but I'll read you the final line. And well, okay, let's start from the beginning. She she can see it all right in front of her. She closes her eyes to see it better, and shoves him screaming into the flames. What a nice ending to the story. And then we kind of cut to white, sort of, and Wonder Woman sort of grapples with like the void and says like, am I alive? And she starts kind of speaking to the hands, who are like, well, kind of. And they talk about what they witnessed, their thoughts on the multiverse, say, well, a lot of this stuff kind of horrified us and stunned us, but we're going to assume a form that we admire, and that actually I can evoke right here. So these are the hands that appear before Wonder Woman. And they talk to her a little bit about, they decided to restore reality because of one thing in particular. Say, you chose to save us when we were going to destroy you. You saved us in a way that we wouldn't have. And I like that moment because, as they kind of state, like it's sort of the central thesis of DC Comics. Like they really kind of boil things down in a way that I quite like. Saving someone who would have hurt you is very superhero. Let's put it that way. And I think Scott Snyder understands that so much better than so many other writers, especially in the world of DCEU. Let's put it that way. He's definitely one of my favorite comic book Snyders out there, to put it a little more specifically, because he just gets it in that regard. And so they decide to create the Omniverse, and they explain it pretty well here, where it's like, well, we're restoring everything, and we're also doing something we've never done before, which is just a multiverse without limits. So there are threats that even we might not predict, but we're kind of trusting that you, specifically, like these superheroes, will be able to navigate it. And I was like, wow, that's quite the way to end things. But They do go a bigger step further where they kind of give us a glimpse of the new normal. There's this like combined Legion of Doom and Justice League thing that I don't even know what they're going for here. I was surprised by that moment. Especially because, oh yeah, I forgot to mention, Luther kind of sacrifices himself to save Superman. It's a great moment in this book, but I kind of brushed past it. But Luther's restored to life, and they kind of go over the new multiverse, and it's kind of interesting. So, like I said, everything matters still, and that includes the orrery of worlds, which is still there. It's just boundless now, so there's a lot more worlds around it. And the only thing they haven't accounted for is Darkseid. And there is only supposed to be one dark side, but they also note there's only really supposed to be one center of the universe, and that's not the case anymore. So who knows? But now there's two centers of the universe: the Prime Earth and an Elseworld, as they put it, which I found really fascinating. And then we end on Sergeant Rock writing all of this down in Carter Hall's journal, as it turns out, 1943. And he's explaining, I want to write this down while I still remember it because I can feel reality taking hold. And just like after the original Crisis of Infinite Earths, things are in flux, memories are going to kind of be shuffled, but ultimately, most people will remember everything, every story you've ever read or seen. That's cool. That's interesting. It has a lot of implications for long lived characters in terms of their actual chronology that I would like to see explored in the future. But as he writes this, Carter Hall's like, hey, what the hell are you doing to my journal? And he's like, oh, I'm sorry, I was just borrowing it. Here you go. He gives it back to him. So that document's a very interesting document now. And then he joins the Justice Society of America to fight in World War II because every story matters that you've ever read. And that's death metal. So I guess I went into it with a little more depth than I perhaps originally intended. But, you know, these are always different than any sort of complete story or recap that might come in the future. And, you know, we should all be patient about that. These things take time, but it is on the horizon. So, because it's just so, I enjoyed it. And I want to revisit all of it. So, stay tuned for that, I guess. But I haven't even really been looking at comics. I apologize for all the buffering. I kind of warned you guys that might be happening this stream because I just have not had a good internet connection. In my defense of my internet service provider, it is generally quite reliable historically. For those of you wondering, and I do want to kind of disclaim it, I've been drinking a lot of beer on the last few streams, but to be fair, it is one 12-pack that's been over the course of like 5 or 6 streams now, so it's not like I don't know. I just want to contextualize things. Adrian says, "Oh, and yeah, I kind of figured you were saying that to be a laugh, but it was worth dwelling on your point whether or not you were joking from way earlier. But I'm way behind on chat." Tevia says, compared to Death Metal and Secret Wars 2015, which had the most impact because I feel like 2015 Secret Wars did nothing to affect anything, while Death Metal at least had impact. Well, you know, Secret Wars did change things. It was never really gone in Marvel's case. But also, it very, very much brought Miles over and a couple of other key characters like the Maker, which matters to date. So I wouldn't call it inconsequential either. It definitely isn't in comparison to the implications of everything that just happened in Death Metal. I agree with you there. And I said that earlier even. Death Metal certainly had more impact. Raphael made a pukey emoji because I referenced Heroes in Crisis earlier, but it is, at least there's some proper closure to all of that, I guess. Wally West is still basically immediately forgiven for murdering all those people. And I get that a huge point of Heroes in Crisis and Beyond was like, we don't want to stigmatize or demonize mental illness. But part of why I find that so insulting is the immediate association with mental illness with violent crime when it doesn't. That's kind of what Heroes in Crisis was supposed to push against. So, okay, now we're talking about a whole different, much, much worse event. Raphael says, DC Comics has been on a roll. Now we wait for the event of events, the next DC and Marvel crossover. I've talked about that before and the issues with intercompany crossovers because they tend to be very difficult to be published, so a lot of people are reluctant to get involved with that sort of thing, especially from a creative standpoint. And you want a solid creator behind that sort of thing. Personally, I don't care. Eh, There's so many characters across both universes, especially some that are awfully similar to each other, that I barely care about the existing crossovers, to be honest. So, but that's my opinion. That's just an opinion. Tevia says this gave Superboy Prime a great send off, just agreeing with what I was saying earlier. And Raphael says they really hold on to dark metal. I will say, compared to the original DC metal story, I actually like death metal a little bit more, or quite a bit more actually. Death metal has a lot more characters, so it's just exploring all sorts of crazy alternate Batman as opposed to a select group from the original metal storyline. But of course, metal was needed to introduce death metal, so I give it a lot of credit in that regard. But metal was also way messier in its final little bits of story, where it's like, oh, we'll use this type of metal and this type of metal, and then I'll get this type of metal and this type of metal, and the story is a little janky because of it. In comparison, death metal feels a lot more polished and fun. I lost my place in chat. Chevia says, I am glad Wally West and Roy Harper got to team up one more time. Yeah, even though... but the fun detail of Batman being able to just resurrect anyone who died was used effectively, especially in the final issue. But across the whole book, having Batman wield the Black Lantern ring was a fun twist for the entire duration of this story. It made Batman very thematic with the rest of the story, just visually, but it also was just a good little story arc for his character, who, by the way, was dead this whole time, which is just a fun little detail. And him just being like, the way I thought of it was like him and Necron and just the element of death actually actively trying to battle the Darkest Night and the Batman Who Laughs, just because that force and the like embodiment of death, which is Necron, I guess, like isn't winning out if the Batman Who Laughs actually takes over all of reality. So it was motivated to work with Batman against this. I don't know if they ever... I think they kind of implied that discussion happened between the like Batman and that being, but it's not like Necron was a huge part of the story. But that's definitely where I feel Batman was able to use this power uncorrupted, or like how that happened. Not that it's important either way. Raphael says, I want to know more of the being that took on classic Wonder Woman form. They seem to be the highest peak of power in terms of DC Comics. Yeah, the hands are, I guess, kind of interesting. I'm more interested in the being that Metron talked to in that one tie-in book that is like evaluating the universe and making a recommendation for the hands. He actually really changed as the result of him learning more about the DC universe, and kind of developed a little bit as a character where he's like, oh, this universe is very interesting, and I don't actually make a decision one way or the other regarding its fate, but I think he tried to put in a good word for it, kind of with the hand. I forget how that ended exactly, but he was moved by aspects of it, and I think, like, you know, the head of DC, that ultimately is what saves the DC multiverse that I was talking about earlier. Tevye says, I see future state stuff. I don't know exactly what you mean by that, but it reminded me, it's an interesting implication of future state that all of those stories are canon, of course. The whole point of this story is they even say there could be alternate paths. So one origin story is just as good as any other at this point. It's such a cool idea. I'm all for all this stuff. I think the Omniverse is the best model for continuity in the rules of the DC universe thus far. And I'm really excited about that. It definitely buoys up my opinion of death metal. Lets me look past some of the flaws in favor of its strengths. And I would say its ending is one of them. For once, and this goes right back to my very first review of death metal, which you can go back and check, because I was saying it really comes down to whether or not Snyder can pull off an ending. And for once, Scott Snyder pulled off a damn good ending, in my opinion. I liked it. It did that thing that all these events do, where it kind of gets wrapped up pretty quickly through the power of hope, love, I don't even know, positive feelings, but whatever. I enjoyed the ride. I enjoyed the deeper ending, which is really the conversation between Wonder Woman, the Hands, and the little epilogue that gave us a preview of the new. What do they call it? Because I ordered that book. We're going to talk about that in the near future, in March as well, after Future State ends. An Infinite Frontier, I believe it's called. Yes. And Scott Snyder wrote with a bunch of other people a whole book that's going to get into the Infinite Frontier, which honestly is a better name for it than Omniverse. That's a good description of it. And the power of infinity from a creative standpoint, big thumbs up from me. What else we got here? Hang on. Raphael says the Batman Who Laughs is at this peak of his power with most of the power you can get in the DC universe. He didn't seem sure he was powerful enough to take them on. In reference to the Hands. That's true. They are these godlike beings, but I think they're fine just as this sort of super level cosmic thing. Although, this story does tease a cool way for them to be involved in future stories because anything established with these beings before or anything that they're used to encountering isn't necessarily true of this new Omniverse. Corbin says, so it turns out the empty hand was actually Perpetua's. Yes, we learned that a long time ago, actually. But that is true. She kind of created this universe and created the Monitor, Anti-Monitor, and Forger of Worlds, who further created the universe to her specifications, but that was the hand. It's an interesting little detail. And for those that think, oh, Perpetua is gone or destroyed, nope. She was in a story you read for a DC comic, and therefore she has to exist in the Omniverse, as far as I'm concerned. Doesn't mean Perpetua is going to return or be a huge character, but if a writer ever wanted to, as far as I'm concerned, they can. There aren't no rules like that anymore, and I think that's for the best. Corbin says, now there's a band of hands too. Yeah, we're going to get a little glimpse of them. I don't think we ever really should get more than a glimpse of them taking forms like classic Wonder Woman or whatever else shape they choose to. I really don't think they're a huge plot point, though. I don't think anyone has any big plans for them in the near future. Tevia says, Peter Parker, Spider-Man, and Secret Wars had nothing changed. Oh, you were angling for one more day to be reversed or whatever. Well, they could have, but whatever. Raphael says, currently, who are you enjoying more, DC or Marvel? Well, I feel I'm too behind to be entirely authoritarian on that subject, but they're both doing great right now, to be perfectly honest. They both keep putting out interesting books, trying out new things. I think in spite of everything, I might slightly favor DC, but that really discounts some of the cool stuff Marvel's got going on, including some books I'm going to be talking about on future reviews. I don't want to get too specific right now, but I just read a fantastic Marvel book today that I really didn't expect anything out of. And it's just its own little mini-series that was awesome. And we'll be talking about that soon. Goddamn. So, yeah, I don't want to be too down on Marvel. We'll see how Kingdom Black is going when I get around to reading those. And we'll see how Future State is going when I get around to reading those. So, I apologize for not being totally up to date right now. I'm working on it, but December really hit me hard. And yeah, there's only so much I can do. Tevia says, Death Metal showed Future State stuff, meaning, and it's not a bad question, by the way, Raphael, I can't answer it. Death Metal showed Future State stuff, meaning those future stuff could happen. What you're saying there is wrong. It's an alternate future, like Batman Beyond or any other that we've seen before. No different than Kingdom Come. It really doesn't mean anyone. I keep hearing that from people, like, "Oh, Future State. That's where DC's going in the future. That's what like." There's gonna be a new Batman, and it's gonna replace Batman, and it's like, what are you guys? Have you guys read a comic book before? Do you guys know how this stuff works? Because obviously that's just an alternate future thing, but one of an infinite possibilities that'll change at any given moment. It changes because of the sheer fact that we've read it, and therefore, man, because any Batman writer worth their salt would put a twist or two into that if they actually wanted to go in that direction, which they won't. Sorry to be a little harsh there, but I just can't believe people are actually falling for it. Marvel and DC do this kind of thing all the time. It just blows my mind. Tevia says, question, what does this... Like, they even went so far as to say there's alternate paths in the Omniverse now, meaning that just because something's happened before with the character doesn't mean that that's set in stone or anything like that. Uh, Raphael says her hand looked very manly until we found that it was her hand. Well, her hand, that hand used to be God, so, and it used to have a Green Lantern ring on it. I think Snyder's take is better, to be honest, than anything we really had before. It's also kind of interesting because stuff like the Source Wall is kind of gone, but also it still exists because, again, you've read about the Source Wall before, so it exists in some form or another. It's just not a hard barrier around reality like they used to be. I think it's just a sort of soft shell around the orrery that sort of keeps it in place around the rest of the Omniverse or something. Um, where were we? Uh oh, I lost my thing in chat again. uh, Sam MMMMM63 says Doomsday Clock is still canon because BWL got his Batman Who Laughs got his powers from Doctor Manhattan, or rather the body of Bruce Wayne, who tried to copy his powers. Oh yeah, but sure, again, but that's a story you've read before, so it is canon. Even something like the Omniverse very much allows for Marvel existing right along with it, and Marvel Multiverse very much allows something with DC existing along with it. So they're finally no longer incongruous with each other. So to be fair, those of you that were looking for a crossover between those two companies, there's no reason, and there never really was, but there's extra no reason it can't happen now, or any other crossover between any company in DC. AKA the way it should have always been, and kind of always was, because when push came to shove, they always created new universes and multiverses. That's how they treated the CW, that's how they treated the DCU. So they're just being more honest about it all now. More than anything. Adrian says, now I don't like having bad comics, but I do like the fact that both companies, Marvel and DC, have good comics, and it's not one better than the other, but more of preference. I agree with you completely, Adrian, and he also adds, this is not to discount other companies. And I still agree with you completely on that front, Adrian. It's kind of a better answer than what I had earlier to Raphael's question, to be honest. So Raphael says, I mean, what damage does the last... Huh? I mean, look at what happens to the last new character like Damage. What happens to him? It's all still canon. It's all still true, right? Tevia says in Sideways he's currently gone too. I don't understand how that would be true. No character can be gone. Because there's an infinite number of versions of them. Raphael says, so new character has made it big lately. Well, like Naomi, I really like, and she's going to be in upcoming stories according to Bendis. I don't know. It really depends on how much characters want to follow up on new things, or what you call new. Because the Talons and Court of the Owls have kind of become a mainstay. It feels like Batman Who Laughs was used quite a bit. And if anything, we need a break from that character. Robin King and all these other new characters. And y'all are understanding the story wrong if you think any one of these characters is on any level gone. And that's how I often think about death metal. Like, it's the coolest thing in the world is I could grab one of these comics at random, pick out a page at random, and there's a character there that can be fully explored in some form again. Like, do you guys remember that monster truck that had a consciousness of Bruce Wayne implanted into it? There's like a few pages dedicated to his origin, and he appears across a handful of books. I would love a story dedicated to that in some form or another. There's so much new out there if you want to delve into it. Especially from Snyder, who's been particular. Part of the issue is you gotta really compensate writers to give them motivation to create these characters, because if you create characters that are used heavily in film and stuff, and a writer gets paid for it, then they're gonna create more of those characters. But I don't really know the details of those finances or copyright rules or whatever, so I can't really speak to that one way or the other. I know in the past, DC and Marvel have been terrible about that, though, and I wouldn't put it past them to still be terrible about that. So maybe that's why some characters don't really make it big, because writers aren't overly motivated to do that. But Snyder sure seems to, and it's paid off spectacularly for him, at least from a writing perspective. I would hope it also does so financially. He more than deserves it at this point, because Court of the Owls is like a movie point. It's going to be a plot point in an upcoming video game or two. And has been in the past. he deserves money for all of that. I don't know if he gets it. Um, people are bringing up Bendis's new characters as examples of ones that are bad new characters, and that's a fair point too. There's plenty of examples of bad ones along the way, but I do want to defend DC a little bit in that regard. Raphael says the thing with me is current Marvel and DC cinematic movies changed for new characters has been sluggish because the movies are forcing mostly on A class heroes. Okay, your grammar was not great for that sentence, but broadly, I think what you're saying there is movies are really focusing just on the A-list heroes. To be fair, I feel like the MCU is really starting to branch out by all indications. Like it seems as though their next big thing might be the Young Avengers for one, like among other stuff. Um, but I would say broadly speaking, you're right. Both Marvel and DC are often guilty of going for the top shelf, when meanwhile other very cool characters are lucky to ever get a solo series last longer than like a dozen issues. So I would like to see them focus on some of the more obscure things from both companies too. Now, I think we'll probably leave things there because this buffering and streaming has been atrocious this stream. I have no idea what's gotten through or anything like that. But we've been going over an hour, and it seems like while it's had unstable moments, by and large, it's been pretty good. Yeah, I don't know what happened or what that's about. I did just realize I had another internet browser open there, but not playing anything right now, so I can't imagine it's that. Well, whatever, we'll call it there. But thank you so much for going, chatting with me, guys, and all that stuff. This was a fun stream, as Raphael just said. Tevia does have one more comment, which we'll read now. He says, "What Scott Liddell creations like Bunker, Bartor, Kid Flash were terrible. New 52 Superboy, who's also been erased. No? Again, New 52 Superboy exists just like everyone else. But I liked Bunker, actually. I will say that. He was fun. Adrian says, have a great day and be safe, everyone. Once again, I will 100% endorse Adrian's comment. Tevia, it's good to have you on. You're saying this is fun. Bye. And then Raphael says, now do this for Marvel to catch up. We need to talk of a few Marvel things. Till next time. Oh, don't worry. That's the plan. I mean, it's all coming up. Deceased is another big thing because that's recently wrapped up. So that battle we'll talk about. Well, we have at least a few catch-up videos on the horizon. And they are accelerating. Like, I am getting through this pile faster and faster. The Ninja Genko, I don't know why YouTube keeps blocking your comments, but you have a great day too, man. And I'll see you guys next time here on Comic Island.